And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Paul Emerich France. Paul is a national board certified teacher, adjunct professor, and education consultant dedicated to helping all learners feel seen, heard, and valued in the classroom. Paul has authored over 20 pieces, including articles in prominent publications like Educational Leadership, The Learning Professional, and the International Association's Literacy Today, and blogs in Edutopia, EdSurge, and Education Week. Paul has taught in both public and independent schools, ranging from transitional kindergarten to 5th grade. He spent 3 years working in Silicon Valley, working for an education technology company, founding 3 micro schools and building personalized learning software for the classroom. It was this experience that secured Paul's understanding of human-centered pedagogy that prioritizes humanity over technology. Now, Paul is a sought-after writer and speaker. He serves as a keynote speaker, featured presenter, and workshop facilitator. He has also recently begun partnering with schools in various parts of the country, offering workshop facilitation, team-based and individualized coaching, and consulting with administration teams. As I have come to know Paul over the past few months, I've been inspired by his commitment to supporting teachers and encouraging conversations around identity, sustainable teaching, and learner agency. And I'm excited on behalf of all of Corwin Press to bring this presentation to you all today. And now I will hand it off to Paul to take it away.
Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome. I appreciate it. I have to say really quickly, I see that someone here is from Arlington Heights. I'm taking it as that Arlington Heights, Illinois. I guess they can't respond. You can respond in the chat. I'm from Mount Prospect, Illinois, which is like right there. I have so many friends from Arlington Heights. I'm really grateful that all of you are here today, joining us. Yes, Jean says yes, it's Illinois. Awesome, so cool. I don't get a lot of people that come to these from the Northwest suburbs. So that's super cool. As Melissa said, my name is Paul Emerich France. I have been in education for about 12 years now. I spent 10 years in the traditional classroom, and 2 years ago, I left to start my own practice. So I still do work with students a lot of the time, but I also have the pleasure of working with schools and teachers. There's a group watching here. I went to high school with you, Paul. Oh, hi, Mary Kate. Oh, that's so cool. I love that. How exciting. I'm like blushing a little bit. So I'm actually from Chicago, and that's where I still live. I spent a couple years, as Melissa mentioned, in San Francisco, working for an education technology startup company and network of micro schools. And today I'm actually joining you from Louisville because I'm working with 2 schools here in Louisville on personalized learning. It has been a blast. I've been working with them all school year. I'm looking forward to working with them next year as well. And so while I do miss being in my own classroom with my own students every day, it is such a cool experience to actually talk with teachers all the time about what makes learning more personal. And that is what I hope to talk about with you all today. So please, please, please do feel free and empowered to use the chat, ask questions. I'm pretty good at watching the chat. So if you have a question, I will try and stop and answer. I'll also try and leave a little bit of time for questions at the end if I'm not able to answer yours on the way or throughout the presentation. So today, you'll have to forgive me, I'm still recovering from the flu. So I'm a little, little coffee here and there. So today we will, I want you to think about this as 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're gonna identify the 5 common myths of personalized learning. We'll explore 4 pillars for humanizing personalized learning. We'll discuss how to personalize in 3 dimensions, identify 2 things you are already doing to personalize learning, and I guarantee you, you are already doing something to personalize. You're already doing 2 things, at least, to personalize learning. And we'll choose 1 step to take tomorrow to humanize personalization. And I want to tell you a little bit about why I chose to put those 2 learning objectives in the end there. So just like all of our teaching, professional learning should be accessible to everyone, no matter where you are in your journey with personalized learning. Personalized learning or starting to personalize learning is not a matter of taking your entire practice and turning on its head. A lot of conventional wisdom on personalized learning or a lot of popular personalized learning models will, they sometimes overwhelm teachers because they feel like they have to change everything they're doing. And I believe that there are some big shifts you can make, but there are also incremental shifts you can make in your practice to make your classroom a more humanized and more personalized place to learn. So as we're going through this, I want you to think about some of those things that you're already doing. Or if you see something in the presentation that feels familiar to you or feels like you already do that, you can jot it down or just, log it in the back of your mind. And likewise, if you see something where you go, oh, I could do that, or like, I would like to try that, think about that or log that in the back of your mind, because at the very end, I'm going to ask you to share those in the chat so we can all be inspired by each other and the steps we're going to take to make learning more personal. So I really like to start this conversation around personalized learning with a provocation. So I want you to take a minute and just do some noticing in this picture. Try to suspend judgment, but in the chat, I want you to write things that you see. Don't overthink it. Just jot down some things you see. It's also okay if we have the same answer come up a lot. Michelle says machines, helmets on students. It's supposed to be the year 2000. Indoctrination, classroom of males, forced learning, processing of knowledge, only boys. Headphones, males only, programming. Learning is institutionalized, books, compliance. All students are white. Teacher, boredom, learning by the bulk. Banking concept of education, stuffy, no books in front of them. One kid, ooh, no one's ever said that, Laura. One kid working really hard. A teacher putting books into a machine. Wow, lots of ideas. So someone who said this is supposed to be the year 2000 is right. This is actually a drawing created by an artist by the name of Jean-Marc Cote. And he made a whole series of drawings around the year 1900, imagining what learning might look like around the year 2000. And this is how he imagined learning to be. So a lot of you said, or some of you said that there's a teacher sitting at some sort of machine, putting books in there. There's one student who's probably doing a lot of work, excuse me, to grind those books down, probably into a fine sand. And I'm just assuming that what's been ground down is going through those wires up to the ceiling and then down into the minds of the students. Yeah, it's definitely not a hands-on activity for sure. So this is what Jean-Marc Cote imagined that learning might look like around the year 2000. And in some cases, especially when we're talking about personalized learning, he really wasn't that far off. While we're not actually grinding books down into a literal sand, we are breaking our curriculum down into itty-bitty pieces, automating it through digital technology, and putting it on these programs that our kids oftentimes are asked to sit and use passively. And we call that learning. And now I'm not going to draw a hard and fast line and say that web-based technologies are inherently bad or that they don't have a place or can't be used for some kids. But the problem is that most people who adopt those for personalized learning use them on a really broad scale and at a really and for all students. And this was my experience when I was working in Silicon Valley for the education technology company and network of micro schools. So our charge there was to personalize learning using what we called a playlist at the time. So if you can imagine like a Spotify playlist or something like that, the hypothesis was that in order to personalize learning, the only way we could do this at scale was to use digital technology to provide each child with an individualized list of activities that they would complete. Excuse me. As you can probably imagine, it was unsustainable. So that was the first problem with it. I found that even though we intended for it to become more sustainable with time, I found myself working exceptionally long days, and long weeks, trying to create these playlists of activities or curate activities together that were individualized to every child. But the other problem with this brand of personalized learning was that the degree of individualization actually caused social isolationism, to where it was really hard to find these serendipitous points of convergence where learners could actually learn in community with one another and through one another's questions, because they were all working on different things. Now, was it impossible? No, it wasn't impossible. Kids could help each other with things if they saw what was happening on their playlist, but it's a lot harder to really connect through, learning if you're not looking at the same thing or you're not working on the same thing. And so my time in Silicon Valley brought me to this idea that actually there are diminishing returns on individualization. We tend to think of, or a lot of people tend to conflate the terms personalization and individualization. We think that the more individualized something is, the more individualized our curriculum is, the more personalized it is. But the reality is that it's not, because in order to individualize at scale, we have to leverage digital technology, which ultimately results in a dehumanization of the content because our kids are staring at screens, and that social isolationism, which also can be really dehumanizing, to just be learning alone all the time. Learning's an inherently social process, and our kids deserve to learn in community and find a sense of belonging through learning. But also, that degree of individualization is unsustainable to do that all the time. And so when you consider personalization not as individualization, but instead a pedagogy for humanization, it's not only better for kids, but it's also better for teachers because it's more sustainable. And that's one of the most powerful ideas here, right? Because I think some teachers they start to feel guilty, like I could be doing more, I should be individualizing more, but actually there are diminishing returns on that to where it's not good for kids either. So we need to be able to cut ourselves a break and instead amplify, these high impact practices that make learning more personal and more humanized in our classroom. And I'm going to kind of go through that as we go here. So you'll find this in the book, Reclaiming Personalized Learning, in my book, Reclaiming Personalized Learning, this difference between humanized personalization and dehumanized personalization. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, in part because, I hope you'll check out the book, and I hope you'll spend time wrestling with these ideas as you read the book, but also because I'm sure you can add to this list on your own. It's the notion of humanizing learning is just holding learners' humanity sacred in the process of learning. So I'm sure there are things you can think of in your classroom that help learners connect with their humanity, that help them feel seen and heard and valued, that promote their agency and autonomy, and that help them, cultivate this ever-evolving sense of their own identity. And I'm sure you can think of those times where learners have been dehumanized in your classroom. I know I can think of those times. I can think of old practices that I did that were unintentionally dehumanizing learning in my classroom, and I can think of things that I'm required to do, like standardized testing, that have the potential to dehumanize learning in the classroom. And so as we go, I want you to really, really think about what about these practices I'm sharing actually preserves that humanity. We're gonna examine humanizing personalization in terms of this 4-part equity framework today. So you can think about this in terms of 4 pillars. The first is centering humanity. The second is redefining success. The third is teaching in 3 dimensions. And the fourth is prioritizing connection. So I'm actually realizing I skipped a slide inadvertently because I remembered my 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We skipped the 5. So I want to first talk about these, before we jump into the 4 pillars, I want to talk about these 5 personalization myths. And before I talk about them, I want you to take a second to read them over on your own. And I want you to write in the chat which of these myths resonate with you the most. So I'll give you a moment to think and to process. If you're reading through them and you realize none of them really resonate with you, I want you to feel, or I hope you'll feel comfortable sharing some questions or doubts that you have. And if you'd like to go so far as to write down where you see these in your practice, you're welcome to do that as well. So far, a lot of myth 2. A lot of myth 2. Yeah, myth 2 is a big one. I'll talk about that one in a second. Awesome. So the first myth of personalized learning is what I discussed before, that personalizing learning means curriculum must be individualized. But the reality is, if we universally design curriculum with varied access points, so different types of learners can access what we're trying to teach them, it's a little bit more sustainable, and it's still very personalized, especially if we, work with students and help them leverage their agency. This second myth, which seems to really have resonated with the group, is that personalizing learning means that curriculum must be interest-based. And anyone who's ever taught kindergarten knows this to be true, knows this reality to be true, that interest and engagement are not synonymous. When I was teaching kindergarten, I realized, I was like, well, if I only teach to their interests, then I'm actually robbing them of exposure to all sorts of topics in the world that they could be interested in and don't even know about yet. I also, by only teaching to their interests, I'm taking away opportunities for them to build a rich and diverse schema, which we know is really important for learning down the road and for things like reading comprehension. The third myth is really powerful because it speaks to sustainability. Personalizing learning doesn't actually only lie in the teacher's locus of control. If we partner with students and we build their agency and we encourage them to make choices within boundaries in the classroom, then personalizing learning can actually become much more sustainable for us as teachers, and more humanizing for our students. The fourth myth is that technology is necessary with personalizing learning. And this one used to be a little more controversial, but I think now that we're coming out of distance learning, we're seeing the limits of education technology in the classroom. I think we'd all agree that our kids have learned enough from screens, and that we want them to be learning through human connection in our classroom more than ever. And it's possible if we teach in those three dimensions, we help kids leverage their agency, and we rethink the way that we build curriculum. The fifth myth is that digitally driven personalization paves a path to equity. So this is a really common argument I hear in favor of web-based adaptive technologies, that because they adapt to the child's level, and I'm putting that in air quotes because I think that's a really narrow way to define what a child can do. But if we personalize using this digital technology to their level, then we're giving them content within their zone of proximal development, and therefore education is equitable. And in some capacity, I see some truth in that by building curriculum so that all kids can access it. We are advancing equity work. But we have to remember that equity is so much more than just right content for kids. It's about belonging, it's about connection, and it's about talking about the systemic barriers that our kids are facing every day. And excuse me, that's where the real equity work comes in. It's not a matter of just delivering digitized content and calling it equity and heading home at the end of the day. So to restore equity, the reality is we must focus on inclusive practices that remove barriers to learning for kids. And so it was those 5 myths that really inspired this idea of humanizing personalization and this equity framework. And so again, those 4 pillars are centering humanity, redefining success, teaching in 3 dimensions, and prioritizing connection. So the first one I want to talk about, and this is the part where I'm really going to dig into some classroom practices. So be thinking about those 2 things that you're already doing and that one thing you might want to try doing, maybe even tomorrow. So the first pillar is centering humanity. And this is where we make space in teaching for identity work, storytelling, and discussions of belonging. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me as I talk about humanity. So I am a very proud, openly gay teacher. I wasn't always that way. For the first couple of years of my career, I was only out to a couple people at work, and I was definitely not out to my students. And I write a little bit about this in the book, but it wasn't until I had a really challenging experience in my final year in that school where I realized that the school wasn't ready to welcome people like me into the curriculum. I actually tried to do a lesson on marriage equality, and one of my colleagues and I got in a lot of trouble for it. And so I ultimately decided to leave. And that is actually what brought me to San Francisco and taught me a lot about personalized learning. So in some ways, I'm really grateful for that moment or that period of time in my life. But it really taught me that, schools, when we don't create inclusive environments where we can help all learners feel seen, it has the ability to really dehumanize people. And that can be really harmful. So identity work is really important within this idea of centering humanity. So here are a couple examples. I think the first idea here that's most important is that identity work is more than just getting to know you. It's not just something you do in the first weeks of school. Identity should be required curriculum, and it should be embedded into everything you do. So these two samples here are from an identity unit that I crafted. One of these is an identity mural that I made. So you can see me and then my husband's in there. And throughout, this was one of the final one of the final performance tasks I asked them to do to show what they learned about themselves and, and demonstrate it in a really creative way. The bubble map you see in the upper right-hand corner is also a way that we helped kids share about who they were. You can see that those are color-coded. So one of the ways that I really scaffolded this work was each day we looked at a different color and brainstormed things about ourselves related to that color. So the orange color was roles we play, and the purple color was group identities. And we linked this to our literacy standards by having them brainstorm character traits that related to them. And green was small moments, and the gray was family history. And so ultimately the goal behind this, right, is we want to help students know and see each other in the classroom, because it creates those cultures of belonging, which are critical to equity work. But it also helps us learn more about our students, the ways they describe themselves, and then how we can support them in the classroom. So as I mentioned, those activities were part of a bigger unit on identity. Just going to sort of flip through these really quickly, but I do believe that using backward design is critical to personalized learning. I'm actually working with one of the teachers here in Louisville on that right now. We have to be able to zoom out and see the big picture before we can zoom in and really personalize learning at that lesson level. So this unit's actually on my website, and it's also in my other book, Humanizing Distance Learning. And so you'll see here that I was really intentional about planning this identity work, thinking about what did I want them to know and be able to do, coming up with performance tasks and evaluative criteria for the unit, and then creating a learning plan to structure where I was heading with them. So another really important part of centering learner humanity is learner agency. I like to think about it as, part of what makes us human is the ability to make choices for ourselves. And I can say this from personal experience, that when choice is taken away from you and when you feel like you don't have choice, like for me personally as a gay man, when I felt like I didn't have choice to, bring parts of me into the curriculum, it made me feel less than, it made me feel dehumanized. And so learner agency is critical to this idea of centering humanity as well. When we look at the word agency, I love looking at etymology because I think it tells us a lot about the types of words we're using and if we're actually using the right words. Agency comes from agere, which means to set in motion. And I just love that framing of agency, because that's the idea behind agency, is that we're setting learning in motion in our classrooms and our kids are a part of that. So agency or autonomy or voice and choice doesn't mean unbridled autonomy or, fierce individualism or just independence. Everyone does whatever they want. It's about setting learning in motion in our classrooms so that our kids are partners in making decisions, and so that personalizing learning becomes a little bit more sustainable and a lot more humanizing for our kids. So this is all, excuse me, this is also in the book. I did spend a lot of time thinking about what are those incremental shifts in practice that cultivate agency in our classrooms. Like I was saying before, personalizing learning doesn't mean you have to turn your entire practice on its head, throw out all your curriculum and redo it all overnight. It can start with these incremental shifts in practice that build agency in our students over time. And it also requires you to reflect on some of the things you might be doing that are unintentionally diminishing learner agency in your classrooms. So I'm going to pause for a quick second. I'm going to let you read through this. And again, I want you to put in the chat. Oh, I thank you, Allison. I want you to put in the chat which of these moves resonate with you. If you have any that bring questions or doubts, you can put those in the chat too. I really welcome the pushback, because I think it makes us all better in the long run if we feel comfortable, disagreeing. And then just where you see these in your practice. As soon as you find something, feel free to toss it in the chat. So both Cheryl and Christine are saying helping students connect their efforts to their progress. That is so important. That is the idea of mastery that comes from Daniel Pink's Drive. So his book Drive is called The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. And he defines intrinsic motivation in terms of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So mastery is not the idea that you've achieved, you've checked the box or you've reached the bar. Mastery is actually the idea that you can connect your efforts to your progress. You can see that what you are doing today is actually helping you grow. And so that creates an entry point for humanizing assessment, where, when we partner with kids and to actually tell the story of their learning journey, they're able to see that what they're doing in the classroom is helping them grow, and it's allowing them to connect their efforts to their progress, which is building agency. Saying, I trust you. Allowing for quiet moments is another favorite of mine. I'm really glad you said that, Angelique. I think it's good for processing time for ELLs. Absolutely. I mean, it's good for processing time for everybody. I think sometimes I've noticed this in myself, and I'm sure you've noticed this in yourself as well, because I don't think any teacher has not struggled with this at one point or another. I noticed myself intervening too quickly, because I was feeling this sense of urgency or just wanting them to get it, And so now what I do is when I ask a question or I see that they're really quiet, I sort of sit. Sometimes I even count in my head to help remind me how long I've been sitting and waiting or sitting and listening. And if I see that they're still really quiet, I'll just ask a really simple question. And this is one of the things that you could use tomorrow. Really simple question. I'll say, are you stuck or are you thinking? Are you stuck or are you thinking? Such a simple question. A lot of times they'll say, I'm still thinking. What a great little moment to build their agency and just give them the time they need to think. Because sometimes you just need to chew on something for a while before you're ready. And sometimes they'll say, I'm stuck. And then I can, instead of just unsticking them, then I can have a conversation with them about where they're stuck, why they're stuck, what is getting them stuck, to cultivate an awareness around what is making them stuck and helping them overcome it on their own. So if you're looking for that one little thing, that could be one tomorrow, just embracing the quiet moments and asking them, are you thinking or are you stuck? So another really important part of centering their humanity is actually teaching executive functioning skills, because in order for our kids to act in an agentive way in our classrooms, they have to have the executive functioning skills to do so. So I think of these in terms of 3 buckets: cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control, and working memory. And yes, I do actually use these words with kids. I teach them about their brains, because I think when you know about your brain, you're more empowered to, do things to help you function with more agency in the classroom. These are more in-depth description of these is in the book as well. So the second pillar that we're going to talk about is redefining success. So when I talk about redefining success, this is really about assessment. Not to say, I did say before that that agency is closely related to assessment. So it's not that all of these pillars are mutually exclusive. There's definitely some overlap here, but this one really focuses on success. And I decided that this needed to be part of the framework because a lot of the ways in which we define success in our schools tend to be dehumanizing, especially when we ground learner success in quantitative metrics like standardized test data that not only turn kids into a number, but they also rank order them and reinforce this sort of competitive spirit in kids. So I like to think of us as shifting towards qualitative assessment. I'm a realist in a lot of ways, and I understand that, most of us do not have the power to just say, well, forget those standardized tests. I don't care about those. The reality is they can be kind of consequential, and so we do have to consider them. But we can take small steps to center qualitative assessment. So I think about qualitative assessment as telling the story of a student's learning journey. So what I like to do is house these in journals and portfolios so that it's really easy for kids to flip back and see what they were doing 2 months ago or 3 months ago, or even at the end of the year, seeing what they were doing at the start of the year, so they can then describe the story of their learning journey. I actually just posted an article on Edutopia about getting started with learner-led conferences. Qualitative assessment is so good for learner-led conferences because what it does is it's building language in kids so that when it comes time for their learner-led conference, they can use their portfolio or their journal and even sometimes read from it to share with their families how they've grown. So critical to qualitative assessment is using structure. You can't just like open-endedly ask kids to reflect on their learning without teaching them how to do it and without building some structures. I love this really simple structure: celebrations and things I'm still working on. So this was from one of my students, as you can see, a Unit 5 math reflection. So after they looked at the standards-based rubric and looked at all of their work, they decided which things they wanted to celebrate and which things they were still working on. So this is not only great for building their agency and building their self-awareness, but it's also great for when they take that assessment home, they can, again, just read their reflections to their parents if they're not sure how to have, you know, an open conversation about it just yet. So along with reflections like these is the idea of journaling. And I think journaling is such a great example of qualitative assessment, because what it does is it allows the child to show exactly what's happening in their mind. So the way that I use journals is at the start of the year, all the kids start with blank journals. And this example in particular is a math task that an open-ended math task that we use when we were studying area and perimeter. And so you can see what kids are able to do. I should qualify this too. So this is actually from distance learning. And so when we switched over to distance learning, one of the beautiful things about journaling was that I didn't have to make a bunch of extra stuff. I was just continuing to use these open-ended tasks, and kids were able to demonstrate their thinking on Seesaw just as they did in class. So it was made for a really easy transition. But as you can see here, kids are able to show their thinking in a way that works for them. So this student chose to, you know, draw these different garden sizes and put them on the same page. But you'll see those little brown squares there. Those were for kids to actually manipulate and create different size gardens as they were working through the task.
Paul, can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
There's just a comment from Veronica in the chat about struggling with kids erasing their attempts after they know they're incorrect. Could you address that?
Yeah. So what I always try to think about when any sort of behavior comes up that I'm curious about is why are they doing what they're doing? Like, some people would call this like the function of the behavior. What are they trying to achieve through their behaviors? And so with kids erasing their attempts at a problem, man, if I get really underneath that and I like think about, again, center their humanity and think about them as human beings, I'm thinking that the learning there isn't even really about math yet. It's about their feelings about mistakes. And what I might consider doing in the next mini lesson is talking about mistakes and helping them see the value in them. That's really a great question. I don't think there's one answer for what you can do with that, but I think what I would suggest doing with any sort of thing like that is get to the bottom of the function of the behavior. What are they trying to achieve through that behavior? I have seen that too. I actually had a similar thing happen. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. I actually had a similar thing happen to me. Well, it wasn't erasing attempts, but there was one year I had a group of kids come in, and for whatever reason, they were one of those classes where a lot of them struggled. And I noticed it specifically in writing, that we would sit down at writing workshop and they just wouldn't start writing. And I think, and I relate to this example because I think it was a very similar function of the behavior. Like, I'm just really afraid to fail. I'm really afraid to write something down that's not a good idea. And so we spent a lot of time talking about taking risks, talking about making mistakes. And I kept saying this to them for weeks at a time. And I ended up saying it throughout the whole year, but I said it almost every day at the beginning of the year. I said, I want you to change the way you're measuring your success. I don't want you to measure your success by how perfect your idea is. I want you to measure your success today by how long your pencil's on the page for. Or I would say, I want you to measure your success by how many words you write today. Because I really needed to, because we all know that length is not necessarily the best success metric either. But in that instance, it was appropriate because I wanted to get them away from measuring their success based on writing correctness. I wanted them to open up so I could see what they could do. And so in a way, that question is really, really great for talking about redefining success, right? Because by getting them to open up and by getting them to be okay with it not being perfect, I was able to learn so much about them. I'm like hesitant to say this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. I have heard of some teachers actually giving kids like golf pencils if they're really struggling with erasing all their work, because then they have to just like X something out. You could try that if you really feel like you need that, but I think the more humanizing lesson there is to like actually teach them about mistakes and how they're good and helpful. Thanks for asking that, Veronica. I'm sorry that I missed that. So math journaling plays into all this, right? It relates, or journaling in general, I should say, relates to all of this. That when we give kids the opportunity, we give them blank slates and we ask them to just put what's in their mind on the page, we learn so much about who they are and how they're thinking. And so this example of the math journal actually goes with the prior task. So a big part of math journaling is actually encouraging kids and teaching kids how to write about their thinking, how to name new learning, and how to actually reflect on what they're going to do differently next time. And you'll see an element of that in all of these journal samples here. So in reading workshop journaling, they're doing a very similar thing where they're naming their idea, they're providing evidence, and they're opening up about what's happening in their minds. It's very different from quantitative assessment, right? Because there isn't one right answer. And you really learn a lot about who they are and what they're thinking. And to me, that's the most personal way to teach and learn. I also do feelings journals. I always have a group of kids in my classrooms that really struggle with big feelings, like they have conflicts at recess or they just have things going on in their lives. And so I taught this feelings journal to everybody, in part because I figured if some kids want to use it in their journal, they can. But sometimes when kids have really big feelings and I don't have the time or the availability to help them with it right in that moment, and I feel like it's okay if they wait a little bit to process it with me, I say, go write something down in your feelings journal, and as soon as you're done or later on, we can talk about it. And I found it to be a really helpful way to allow them to be human beings in the classroom, but then use this tool in a really productive way, to help them cope with the big feelings that they have. So central to qualitative assessment as well is rubrics and feedback. This is one of the structures that you need in your classroom to make qualitative assessment work really well. And so you'll notice that the rubrics that these rubrics are really related to standards. They're really grounded in standards because we have to be really mindful about what we're teaching our kids. This example from figure 4.5 over here is a great way to keep track of what you're doing in conferences with kids as you're looking at their journals. I like to just put sticky notes right in because one, it helps me keep track. I can flip back really easily, but also they can look back at your feedback really easily with the sticky notes. This is another example of a journal from social studies. Again, you can see it's really structured. It's structured with a Project Zero thinking routine. It has the task there. But then again, we really get to see what's happening in kids' minds when we use journaling in this way. All right, so I'm going to, just for the sake of time, I'm going to go on to the third pillar here, which is teaching in 3 dimensions. So I mentioned this before, rather briefly, but when we teach I like to think that we can personalize learning in any time of the day. Learning doesn't have to be individualized for it to be personalized. In fact, I believe that personalization can happen in the whole group, the small group, and the individual, and in individualized settings. So thinking about the first dimension, whole group instruction, we have to, I like to leverage the workshop model in order to make sure I'm preserving those points of convergence where we all can come together and build what I call the collective consciousness of the classroom. That convergence allows us to keep learners connected to one another. So I discussed the importance of belonging and helping learners find connection through learning before. And that is the first dimension, when we're all together and we're all converging around a common provocation or common content. But then divergence is really healthy within a classroom that values personalization, because it allows us to create small groups of students. Hopefully those small groups are both heterogeneous and homogeneous. So homogeneous for, kids who have similar academic needs or similar socio-emotional needs, but also heterogeneous so that kids of different quote unquote levels can work together with one another. This second dimension where learners diverge can also entail partnerships where kids are just turning and talking to one another or even just working as partners throughout the classroom. And then the third dimension I refer to as nurturing the child's inner dialogue. And a lot of that happens in conferencing, over the course of the workshop model. So as I mentioned, the first dimension here is shaping the collective consciousness. And when you're considering this first dimension, I want you to think about your mini lessons. When you are shaping the collective consciousness of the classroom, your mini lessons should often be short, should be universal content, right? Like if you're standing up and lecturing for the whole time, it's really hard to keep that personal and personalized if you're doing that for long periods of time. Sometimes in my whole group mini lessons, while I'm shaping the collective consciousness, I'm thinking about competencies or learning habits. So the idea from before about, kids erasing their work, that's such a great thing for a mini lesson because all kids at one time or another are going to, struggle with making mistakes. It's a universal lesson that everyone can benefit from. And I think that's a good barometer for when you're considering to do something whole group or small group. You can just ask yourself, will all my kids benefit from this? And if they will, it's great for, or how will all of my kids benefit from this? It's great for, one of those mini lessons. So as I mentioned before, for small groups and partnerships, we're mixing heterogeneous and homogeneous groupings, but this is also a really important time to make sure you're leveraging formative data to make flexible groupings. The journals are great for this because you can look at what the kids are doing in their journals. You can pull small groups either to facilitate a conversation between groups of kids that are heterogeneous, or you can facilitate a conversation based on groups of kids that have a really similar academic need or a really similar social emotional need. And then this final dimension of nurturing the inner dialogue. In the book, I talk a lot about conferencing efficiently because conferences become kind of a sticky point for a lot of teachers where it becomes unsustainable. They're like, I can't get to all my kids over the course of one learning block. And you don't have to get to all of your kids over the course of one learning block. But if you give yourself a structure to work within and you conference efficiently by providing just one compliment and one suggestion, or one, the school I'm working with today, they do glows and grows. So one glow, one grow. It can make it really easy for you to see a lot of kids. And it also makes it just really attainable for your learners, because if we provide them more than one suggestion or more than two suggestions in a conference, it's really unlikely they're going to be able to do it. So my experience is that it's by providing one compliment and one suggestion, it's forced me to really prioritize like what really matters right now for this child in this conference to nurture their inner dialogue. It's really helped me. And then, like I said before, you can document the conference notes using sticky notes in their journals. Again, it's just something that's more sustainable for me as opposed to keeping really lengthy notes that I never actually end up going back and reading anyway. All right, I'm going to move on to the last pillar, which is prioritizing connection. So, again, as I said before, I think it's really important that after 2 years of distance learning or 2 years of pandemic teaching, that it's really important that we keep kids connected to one another, that we make a lot of opportunities for kids to, connect over learning. And one of the ways we can do this is through complex instruction. So this term was actually coined by two Stanford researchers in 1997. And the three guiding principles behind complex instruction are multiple ability curriculum, human-centered instructional strategies that get kids talking to one another, and then culturally aware pedagogy that actually proactively addresses issues of status and equity in the classroom. And so that third component is really critical here. I mean, all the components are critical, but that third one especially, it relates to that fifth myth of personalized learning. When we think of personalizing learning in terms of digitally individualizing curriculum, what ends up happening is that the kids who we call low get the least sophisticated curriculum, and the kids who we consider high or we label high get the most sophisticated or most advanced curriculum. And what we're doing right there is creating a huge opportunity gap that's only going to get wider as they engage more and more with those tools. And so that's why I really advocate for these pedagogies that connect kids together and keep them together through an open-ended task, such as this one. So this one, you can see, it just says each square in the picture measures 1 inch on each side. I invite the kids to ask questions. I say, what kinds of math questions do you think we can answer from this? And they'll say things like, which one's the biggest? Which one's the smallest? What's the area of all of them together? And what's super cool is then you get this diverse array of work products, right? And it's like a picture like this that makes me think this is personalized learning. It's not individualizing the curriculum on their behalf. It's inviting them to leverage their agency to, individualize the curriculum for themselves through their methods and by showing their thinking. And I learn so much about my students when they do things like this. And I mean, I do things like this every day with my students. And so I learn a lot about them every day. So you can see like the student on the left is using this really sophisticated strategy of negative space. They noticed that all of those boxes were 10 by 10, and they just subtracted the negative space from them. And then you can see the third journal, it's really broken down. They're using a lot of color. So they're using a lot of strategies to really support their thinking. And that was actually one of my students who at the beginning of the year, really struggled with math. And actually at the beginning of the year, we were using one of those web-based adaptive tools. This was a while ago. And he just sat there forlorn, arms crossed, because that tool didn't actually help him get what he needed. It was just another frustrating thing that he couldn't do on his own. And so journaling and complex instruction has really opened up opportunities for personalized learning for me in the classroom. Planning for it can be a shift. And so this is actually on my website as well, Planning for Complex Instruction. I'm using this right now with teachers I'm coaching here in Louisville. And we take a task, we deconstruct the learning objective that comes with it. And then what we do, we plan a lesson structure grounded in the workshop model. But what we actually do is anticipate student responses so that we can think through what are all the things that are going to happen, what are all the ways that our learners are going to leverage their agency in this lesson, and then anticipate the ways that we can respond to it to just help them inch themselves along with the task or with the learning. So you'll see that in the teacher moves there, what I actually do is generate a lot of questions I can ask, because I want to reserve those moments where I give really directed feedback to the kids for when they really need it, and instead use questioning to help them really think critically and think critically and move themselves along in the lesson. So another part of this idea of prioritizing connection is Edtech minimalism. I think sometimes when people read my work or hear me talk about EdTech, they think I'm anti-EdTech, and I'm really not. I think that education technology has great benefits in the classroom, but only if we use it in ways that are humanizing. And so these 4 questions actually also came out of my time working in Silicon Valley for the education technology company, because it really helped me, that experience really helped me reflect on when technology helps and when it hurts. So the first question is, will the technology minimize the complexity of personalization? Technology should be making our lives easier. It should not be making our lives harder. And if it's making your life harder, that's a really great reflection moment, because it shouldn't be making your life more complex. The second question is, will the technology maximize individual power and potential? So along with it minimizing the complexity of personalizing learning, it should also be making me more powerful in the classroom. I find that one of the ways I become more powerful and become more sustained in the classroom is by giving my kids agency, not by downloading an app that is supposed to personalize learning for me. The third question is, will the technology reimagine learning? So we shouldn't be using technology just for the sake of technology. We should be using technology to change the way we think about teaching and learning. And then the final question is, will the technology preserve or enhance human connection? When I was working in Silicon Valley, I felt that the technology we were using was causing our kids to look towards their screens more than they were looking towards each other. And that is where that idea came from. But that idea was that fourth question of, does the technology preserve or enhance human connection, guided me through distance learning. It was like a North Star for me. it was like, I just was constantly asking myself, what am I going to be doing while my kids are having to learn from home to make sure they're staying connected to one another? And I swear to you, complex instruction and open-ended tasks did that for me, because I was able to give all the kids the same task in a really sustainable way. I could put them in their own little breakout groups, and I could rotate between those groups and facilitate these beautiful conversations all while they were learning from home. It's even easier when you're in a real life classroom, because it's sustainable, but you can just walk between groups and facilitate those conversations. So if at any point, I don't want to imply that your answer to all of these questions will be yes, because different technologies have different purposes. But if any of your answers to these questions are no, I just want you to make sure that that tech you're using in the classroom is really helping and isn't dehumanizing in any way, or limiting the humanity of your kids. Okay, so we've learned a lot today. We've talked about the 5 myths. We've talked about these 4 pillars and all of these practices that go with these 4 pillars. Again, I hope you'll check out the book, because I go into much more depth in the book about a lot of these practices. But I want you to take a moment to reflect. And actually, these self-reflection structures are ones I use in my classroom as well. So you could use these with your kids. But I want you to identify 2 things you're already doing that's personalizing learning. So 2 things that resonated with you throughout the presentation. That's like, I'm already doing that, or I can do that, or I'm doing something very similar to that. And then I want you to identify 1 step that you can take tomorrow to make learning more personal in your classroom. So 1 thing that you want to try, 1 thing that you want to embrace a little bit more, or 1 thing you want to take a risk on. And I'm going to let you think for a second while you put that in the chat. While you're reflecting on that, actually, Melissa sent me, there's a question from the beginning that I did not get to address yet. Such an interesting question. Joanne asked, is homeschooling wrong? Has learning always been communal in all parts of the world throughout history? I don't really know the answer. I really can't give an answer to that. I actually work with some kids who are homeschooled. And I think that homeschooling is such a personal choice. And for some kids, the systems that are in their communities just don't support them as learners, and parents have to make really hard decisions about that. I do think that having public schooling around is really helpful, right? Because I do think that education is such a critical part of just the fabric of our society, that it needs to be there. But I don't necessarily think homeschooling is wrong. I think some people would say that homeschooling will allow you to personalize learning more, will make learning more personal for kids. I don't necessarily think that's true, because I think sometimes homeschooling can become just as industrialized as, as really big public schools can be. But I think that's an interesting idea to consider in this idea of personalized learning, because we want our schools to feel like, second homes for kids, where they feel really safe and they feel like they belong. And so it makes me think about, finding the best parts of homeschool and bringing them into our schools to make our classrooms more personal places to learn. As I'm looking through the reflections here, I see people wanting to look into feelings journals, the math reflection, student-led meaningful technology-based projects, going to say, I trust you more, discuss success metrics for the day, journaling, trying the feelings journal, minimizing online virtual resources, journaling. I love it. Leave space for the students to teach us. Yeah, it's funny. It's interesting when you just open up opportunities for self-reflection and for kids to share what's happening in their minds. You learn so much from them. It really is just a matter of being open to it. Making kids partners in learning. I love it. So many great reflections. Questioning, reflection and journal.
Well, yes. While all this journaling is coming up, I wanted to flag another question that was posted earlier in the chat. Samantha was wondering, how do you get kids excited about journals?
Ooh, that's a great question. How do you get them excited about it? So that's a tough question, because I think some of your kids just won't be excited about it at first. And it goes back to that same idea of like getting to the root of it. Like, why aren't they excited about it? You know? So what I try to do in the beginning of the year is just make sure they feel successful in some way with journaling, and make sure they know that they can do something with journaling, even if that means just like drawing a picture to represent the situation from the math task or something like that, even if that means just writing one sentence or one word. So to me, it's not necessarily about getting them excited, because some of them might not be. And I guess I also just believe I can't make my kids feel something. But what I can do is help them experience some success. And so I think that requires, you know, building on their assets, praising, and then going from there so they can really connect their efforts to their progress as they continue to grow. That's a great question. Yeah, Veronica said some students just don't like writing, and I think there's definitely some truth to that as well. But I also think that, you know, how we help them feel success in these subjects is gets them more excited, or just gets them more engaged in the process, and they see it as helpful or useful to them. But that's a great question. I think there was one more question I just saw. Oh, someone asked at what grade you should start journaling. I think you can start journaling super young. I mean, as young as kindergarten. Excuse me. It just looks different, right? In kindergarten, it's like more about them drawing what they're counting or something like that. So you have to consider, you know, what type of thinking you want them to do, and that's the type of journal they can do. Or maybe in writing workshop, journaling looks a lot like drawing pictures and labeling them. So I think as long as you make sure it's developmentally appropriate and you put some structure around it, you really can start it at any age. Awesome. Well, I really just want to say again, thank you so much for coming today. If you'd like to learn more, please check out the book. I'm actually also teaching a class at Northwestern University this summer called Designing for Personalized Learning, which you can get graduate credit for, and you can also get PD credit for. I'm also working on a new project right now on sustainable teaching. So if you're interested in contributing to that, I'm surveying people and interviewing people. You can go to the QR code that's right there, or type in the URL, and you can tell me your thoughts about sustainable teaching. And then I actually have 2 more webinars coming up with National Board. One is specifically a deep dive into learner agency. And then June 16th is about shifting towards qualitative assessment and redefining learner success. So you can access those through the QR code there as well, or also go to the link that's right there, nbpts.org/support/webinars. Truly, I'm so grateful that you all came today. I don't think we have time for a ton of questions, but you can also reach out to me. Paul@paulemerick.com is my email, and I'm happy to chat with you more via email.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you to everyone who participated. What a wonderful, rich conversation we were having in the chat. And Paul, it looks like people want you to go back to show that QR code again. And you'll all be receiving a recording of this webinar and your certificate of attendance. So thank you all so much.
Thank you all.